We're back for Your Ears Only. I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Exelberth with a quote from the news. There has to be representation of those who are on the front lines fighting and dying today to obtain their freedom. That was Secretary of State Hillary Clinton shifting support away from Syrian opposition leaders outside the country for decades. But she also said armed opposition groups need to publicly dismiss extremists intent on hijacking their revolution. Now this.
The party holds a national congress every 5 years. This year, China will undergo its once-in-a-decade leadership change. Sources close to the party say the number of Political Bureau Standing Committee members will be reduced to 7 from the current 9. The change is intended to speed up the decision-making process.
Would that the impending change in China's leadership really be as simply motivated as reported on NHK Japanese television last week. But in fact, it will reflect a marathon backstage struggle between different generations, different factions, bureaucratic interests, and confederacies of exploitation. Still, the result will reflect an unprecedented degree of public disclosure of high-level corruption and grassroots protests in behalf of more real democracy.
And it may have major impact on China's most important domestic and foreign policies. To discuss all of these factors on the eve of yet another era in modern Chinese history for Your Ears Only, we're joined now by Dr. Elizabeth Economy, Senior Fellow and Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, where her blog is Asia Unbound. Welcome to our program, Doctor.
Thanks very much.
Let's start with the impact of scandal on the leadership change. First, the downgrading of Bo Xilai, an ambitious party leader whose wife was convicted of arranging the murder of an expatriate British businessman. How widely was it even known among the Chinese people?
Well, I think certainly before the scandal broke publicly, before Bo Xilai's police chief, Wang Lijun, went to the American consulate and presented all this information to the American officials and sought asylum, in the United States. Before that happened, there was, I think, not even a whiff of scandal within Chongqing or within the country writ large. Once that happened, however, and the Americans presented the information to the Chinese leadership in Beijing, I think then the whole thing broke open, and now, of course, it's led probably to the biggest political scandal in recent Chinese history.
Was Bo connected with any one of the most powerful party leaders, or does his previous prominence just reflect badly on the entire party system for accepting his corruption and letting him rise so high?
Well, I think both are true. In fact, he himself was quite senior. He was within the Politburo and was widely considered to be a top candidate for the Standing Committee of the Politburo, the top 7 to 9 people who govern the country. But he was tied pretty closely to the public security apparatus, to Zhou Yongkong, who managed the security for the country, as well as some military commanders. So he had high-level ties. And as well, I think, he himself, his downfall really is just the tip of the iceberg, because now the Chinese people have begun to see, a set of scandals that have followed this Bo Xilai scandal and realize that this corruption is quite widespread within the top echelons of the Chinese leadership. I think, in the past, really the Chinese people have looked at the local officials and realized that, at that level, there's an enormous amount of corruption, and that's why, there's so many widespread protests within the country. But the revelations about Bo Xilai, about soon-to-be President Xi Jinping's family wealth, and about Premier Wen Jiabao's $2.7 billion of family wealth, this is something quite different for the average Chinese, because they previously thought that Beijing leaders there were relatively corruption-free. So this is quite eye-opening for the average Chinese person. And via the Internet, yes, many Chinese have access to this. While they try to close down the websites of places like the New York Times and Bloomberg, which have reported widely on this elite corruption, these things get around. And there are over 500 million Internet users in China, so this is not an elite phenomenon, it's a mass phenomenon.
Talk about the issues or interests that divide the current top leaders. Is it reformers versus conservatives, army versus oil ministry, overseas adventurous versus the more cautious?
I think at this point, really the Chinese leadership faces a set of pretty stark choices and is quite divided. So whether you're talking about the economy and the need to sort of divest of these vested interests, as they say, right, to really move toward an open market, an entrepreneur-friendly kind of Chinese economy, break down the stranglehold that the state-owned enterprises have on the economy. That's one very significant choice that confronts the leaders. Another is, as you suggest, the sort of more adventuristic, assertive Chinese foreign policy that we've seen in the past 3 years, as opposed to the sort of Deng Xiaoping-led foreign policy of keep your head down, focus on domestic development. Don't be too assertive. That's another choice that this next leadership needs to make. And the third is really perhaps the most important, and that is what is the path of future political reform? Will China really open the door to much more aggressive political reform, or is it going to continue to try to stay the course and, invest more in domestic public security than it spends on all of its national security because it has so many protests? And I think that those are three very stark choices, and the leadership is really quite divided on all of them.
Talk about the lingering influence of former party and government leaders. Exerted how?
They meddle. They meddle in the choices. They meddle in the process going forward because they're very concerned to preserve their legacy. One of the most important reasons behind why China has failed to acknowledge what took place on June 4th, 1989, is the continued presence and influence of Li Peng in the decision-making process. So these people may retire, but they never really leave the political process.
And how do you see the change in makeup of top leaders affecting China's relations with the United States?
Well, I think, frankly, on the whole spectrum of issues, including the relationship with the United States, the makeup of the Chinese leadership is critical. Right now they have a choice. Between 7 and 10 names have been floated. We know 3 really for sure, maybe 4. And who comprises the remaining 3, 4, 5 really will be quite critical because there are a couple of political reformers, I think, who have a very open and engaged kind of approach to the United States. And there are some others, I think, that are not as prone to want to work with the United States and who are likely to be far more assertive in their foreign policy and far more nationalistic. And I think depending on, who precisely sits within the Standing Committee, we could have very different orientation to the United States and, frankly, a very different orientation toward foreign policy more broadly.
Dr. Elizabeth Economy is Senior Fellow and Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, where her blog is Asia Unbound.
Quote from the news, "There were no orders to anybody to stand down in providing support." That was an anonymous CIA official claiming that agency personnel arrived within minutes to counter a terrorist attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya, that killed the U.S. ambassador and 3 other Americans. Why prior requests for additional security were denied is still under investigation.
Next, how the meningitis epidemic from tainted steroids affects pain patients and their doctors around the nation. For your ears only.